depends on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's confident you can say like, oh, they did this like on their end, they did this English. And they're not that between. That's something.
Okay, so let's talk about unit 6, which is chapter 8. So this particular unit focuses on identity and access management. It does talk a little bit about attacks and things down the line, but and I think this one will also go good with my lab for tomorrow's class, which is ethical hacking. But so I really feel like access management is the key. It is also an area where many companies are not doing their job in managing well. So that's why you have a lot of security issues. So we understand that we identify by creating the user's account to the groups, right? The container that the users or the system would be in. And identities on the cloud sometimes can be difficult to manage, especially if you have many users. So in access management, you would identify, right, the subject. So by giving the system the information about the user and then setting up their credential, which is related to the login, and their privileges, which is their access rights. Then after that, sometime the company would tie that back into the role. So we want to apply least privilege rule that we would only allow them to access what is necessary. And then if you are looking at systems or objects, we would look at attributes, right? Attributes just means that it represents the characteristics of a certain object. If it's a file, some attributes could also imply like whether backup attributes or a specific area of the file on how that file is also used. And so when you identify, you give the system and the subject the identities. And with that, we want to correlate that with what are they given as access. And so we have to think about what are the things that the attackers are looking for. And that way we would be able to control the access management properly. So with that, identities are really used in the AAA: authentication, authorization, and accounting. Right? Authentication, that is with credential, where you might do multi-factor authentication, so that way the user can log in. Authorization, that would pertain to access rights and sometimes permissions. And then accounting is going to be the logging area. It's going to keep record of who is accessing what, all the events that's happening between the subject and the object. So remember the AAA framework, and this is always going to be used in access management. So to answer the first few questions, it asks you to refer to the notes and describe processes in the AAA framework for access management. So in authentication, the user would provide credentials to validate their identity, right? And we talked about how we use their identity, who they are. So if they are a staff in a certain department, they might belong to a certain group, and we would control that group on what they could access. So when the user log in, it's just a way to validate that user to the system and to the authentication server that they are who they are, right? So when you provide the password or your biometrics, or even, you know, the OPT code, those things just to validate to the servers that you are who you say you are. Or you would match the identity that's on their system. The second area is the authorization. So once the user authenticate, they are given certain privileges on that system and maybe certain access level to the resources like files, folders, or drives. So the user would be granted privileges to access resources on the system, like saving files or just be able to view them. That would be related to permissions. Or be able to modify or install applications. That would be related to access rights or privileges. So with authorization, it's always going to come after that the user validates themselves to the system, right? So the authentication system would give them a security token that would entail what they can be allowed to do, right, on that system or on the network. And that's part of authorization. And then the third A is for accounting. All of the activities or the actions that the user commit on that system is logged, right? Even the failed or the successful attempt. So for example, let's say that I don't have the privilege to modify or configure a certain application. But in that, I would attempt and I would get a warning error or some kind of error saying that I do not have the permission to do that, right? But in that attempt, the system also record that. So when we log the failed attempt, it's gonna log all of the activities that the user or the other systems that are using certain resource or fail to use a certain resource. And it's important to really think about, we don't only record successful attempt, but we record, right? It's accounting for the failed attempts. Now, the problem with that, with security and IT is that you are gonna have lots and lots of events. So just think about from the time that the user turn on the computer until the time that they log off the system, that could be many hours. And there would be a lot of different actions that the users are committing in that system or initiating in that system. So what we would see is that logs can be very, very large. And going through the logs can be quite a task, right? So when you're looking at something like failed attempts, sometimes that could be an attacker trying to do something and not be successful at it. But as you know, a thoughtful attacker or a planned attacker is the one that does their homework, is when they actually already expect that, right? So they would know that they only have one attempt and that one attempt needs to be successful. So it needs to be logged as well. So when we come back and we're responding to an incident, we normally use accounting. So that's more on for detection purposes, right? And these two are on the preventative purposes, right? For access management. Any question? Okay, so you can find this information on the notes. I just kind of summarize it just to give you a better understanding, but you need to know what these AAAs are for security certifications. So in the next area, we're going to touch on identity access management. This is really big with the cloud. So if you're using AWS or Azure or a lot of like the different type of servers that we would incorporate for infrastructure, you would see that it is identity access management is a way that we can centralize and we can manage all of the information for the users, the groups, the permissions, all the things that are needed that's tied to the identity. Just like how you are identified as a student, right? You are also identified as a Californian, right? So that's to the state. And then with the federal government, you're identified as a resident or a US citizen, right? Depending on the status. So what you would see is that this identity can be various, but it needs to be centralized. So as a user, I might belong to many groups because I might hold different roles in my job functionality, right? My responsibility might entail multiple group membership. So this is a system that really can manage a lot of that. And it is a way that we would look at who belongs to which group and what are they allowed to do. So identity system is used for federation and authorization purposes. We use this to really provision what that user is intended to do on their system, right? Controlling the access management, the services that are tied to their responsibility on a daily basis. And so, but then for the security side, we would then need to manage it with the rules. So if we would be able to get some kind of notification if someone is attempting certain things that doesn't belong to this rule, right? So it's blocking it, or they're trying to break the rule. So for identity access management, or your IAM, right? It's used to create, store, and manage identity information, such as groups, permissions, and other information needed to support identity. So a user would belong to a group. They would have some form of group membership. Out of the box, all user belongs to the users group. Right? You see that in Linux today, and also the same in Windows. So when you create a user account, first thing, even if you don't put it into a group, the OS would put it into the users group. Administrators is also in the users group, but the administrator identity is elevated because the privilege for the group membership that they're in is higher, right? It's kind of like I belong to the faculty group at Moreno Valley College and you belong to the student group, right? Because of our roles. So we would have group membership to really control either role base, or we can also tie that back into, different model of access management. And then for the permissions, we have to think about the objects that they use. So that would tie into the type of systems, the files, the folder that they would use, and so on. Now, in authentication system, you would see, right, lightweight directory for authentication protocol. This is used LDAP. If you install Active Directory, you're using LDAP. In Linux or Unix-based system, you would have similar directory type of service, but LDAP is really a way for us to centralize the database of, right, access management on who is the user and what they belong to. So let's come back here for a second, and then we'll touch back on. So directory services. So if you're looking at non-Windows system, right, you often see that it is the directory services. And it's just a way that we organize the identities into some form of database. So identity could be users or a system, right? Like your local host. It could be a certain system name. And then your lightweight directory access protocol, this is how we would see it. So at the top level, right, when you're seeing something like example.com or nmap.org, right, the root is the .org or the .com. So the parent directory, or at the top level, the domain top is going to be, domain controller is going to be the example, right? And its root is .com. So when you install a DNS, right, normally we would use a DNS, and in order to access that domain, you need to have a directory service. That means that you have to have the user accounts, the groups, the systems that would be able to access that domain. Because what's the point of having a domain and nobody accessing it? It doesn't make sense, right? So this is why whenever that you install the DNS for the Windows side, you have to have Active Directory, because then we would have the entities or identity for the entity to access the domain. Then what you would have is you might have organizational unit. And for Microsoft, this is just a container. This is simply a container where we would have it, we would use it for the department, So in that domain, you might have many departments, just like how in the organization, you might have many different departments, and within that, you might have subgroups like teams. So we can have things in the container, and then we would tie the groups to that container. And that's how you manage it. Now, I might have a subdomain that's underneath here, and within it, I might also have organizational unit. So subdomain can function as, you know, maybe an extension of that company, or within the company, they would break it down. So for example, I would use OU as branches, and then within that, I might have groups as my departments. But for some administrator, they might have OUs as the department because all branches have the same department. And then they might have subdomains to represent location or region. Like, for example, if you think about Pizza Hut, they're kind of franchised, right? They're owned by the original company, but ultimately it comes back to like what certain group that owns that. But you still have pizzahut.com, which is their domain, and they would use that for e-commerce purposes. But they might have extension to that by using the subdomain or the child domain in what you see with hierarchy. So you might have child.pizzahut.com, right? Or Southern California or California.pizzahut.com. So it really varied on how they would lay out and the naming convention for that organization. Now, if I'm not using proprietary software like Microsoft, you can use Open LDAP. There's also 389 directory server, Apache DS. So this is for Linux, you know that Apache is used for Linux server. And the majority of your web servers out there are Linux-based servers. You do see CIS, which is Windows-based. And then you have OpenEJ. So you have many other products outside of the proprietary product. And then if you're using Oracle, Oracle has Internet Directory. And then for Microsoft, it's Microsoft Active Directory. So in some proprietary product, you do see that they have specific directory. And, you know, the concept is still the same, right? You have the top level domain, and then within that, you can have containers and subunits of it. Okay, so why is this important? Because when we're looking at directory, when we're doing auditing and analysis for this, we have to really understand how directory works in access management, like LDAP. And also TLS is used, why? Because the user are now authenticating through HTTPS, right? Which is encrypted format. So TLS piggyback on HTTPS. So that way the user can authenticate by using the username and password through the web interface. So for example, when people are logging into their bank account or paying their bills online for the utility companies, things like that, right? You basically use this in the back, okay? So one thing that we need to focus on is how the password is stored and how secure is it, okay? I know that for Windows, we would say that for authentication method, it uses Kerberos, right? And there is challenging handshake that's involved within the communication of the system, but is it 100% secure? So you really have to see where that password is stored once a user authenticates, because it's on a database, then you might have SQL injection issue, right? If you're storing it on a specific like authentication server, is it encrypted? Is it protected? So we have to look at the service that's used to store this password. So there are 3 operational modes, or the modes for LDAP. Your operation, anonymous, and unauthenticated, okay? So when you're using username and password that is authenticated, the unauthenticated mode should always be disabled. That's kind of like you can access the domain without saying who you are, right? Public domain, yeah, you can find static information on there, but when you have interaction with the system, you need to make sure that we want to have accounting. We want to log who's doing what, right? So that way we can track and detect any kind of issue. So with that, you need to implement access control lists. Okay, ACL. And so permissions and privilege, and then be able to modify how the object is accessed. So we can say for number 3, when TLS is used for authentication, right? This is where we would see that there is encryption because TLS has encryption and it's used with HTTPS. So we are using encryption, so it is secure for authentication. We want to secure password storage. So we would use LDAP for that. And then when you're using access control lists to control how the object is created, like how your file is created, right? In Windows environment, you would have NTFS permission. And with that, you would see access control list. So what do I mean, right? For example, sorry, I'm gonna do this real quick. Let's say that I wanted to look at the property of my folder. I would go to the properties and then security tab. So this is the access control list. And it would have related permission for a specific group of users or the user. Now you can modify this, you can change it, you can, whatever that's needed, but it really identifies who creates the file and what do they have access, what level of access do they have. Okay, so access control list, and each of the line inside that list is called ACE, and that is just access control entry. So the system would require, if you have, in order to have that, it has to bring forward who is the user, who is the group, right? If you don't have that form of directory, it will not allow you to find the users and the groups or the system. So for the operational modes that should be disabled would be anonymous and unauthenticated, because you want to identify, right? And you want to have authentication, you want to have authorization. So you want to implement the AAA framework. And when you're using the modes that are anonymous and unauthenticated, you cannot apply the AAA, okay? So in security, AAA is integrated in everything that you use these days, right? You have to use multi-factor to log into things. Sometimes you have to log into other things to log into that original application that you want to access. So we want to disable things that we cannot account for. Okay, because accounting is gonna allow us to track the activities that's happening to the subject and the object when they're on the system. And how those things could change, like the state of the subject and the object would change. So what we want to be able to account for that. What's access on the system? Any questions? Okay. So I know that you're trying to record all of the information, but let me go back to the notes. So authentication protocol is next, right? TACACS, and you've probably seen this many times if you have taken some of the security classes. So this particular type of protocol is designed by Cisco. It is used for terminal access. So hence the name terminal access controller, access control system. It is repetitive, right? But it basically uses TCP traffic for authentication, authorization, and accounting, the AAA framework. Why TCP? Because TCP established SYNAC, right? It has to synchronize and acknowledge before it transmit. So you have stability and you have consistency. The lack of an integrity checking on sent data, that is the problem with this particular protocol, is it's allowing attacker to access the traffic. So they just have to sniff it out and then be able to stuff packets or change or use replay attack. Okay. So there are many ways that you can do sniffing attacks, right? Through hardware or software level. But the flaw in this particular protocol is that it doesn't do integrity check of data. That means that when the data arrive, it needs to do the checksum and also be able to make sure that the data is not modified. So a hash mechanism needs to be integrated to make sure that the integrity is there, right? So if I send a file at the beginning, it should be the same exact file or the same type of data, the same value for that data when it's arrived. So the keys can be compromised. So keys, not all encryptions are great encryptions. It really comes down to how the keys are exchanged, okay? How the keys are shared or sent, okay? So if the encryption keys are not being properly communicated or saved, it could be compromised. And if we use this for authentication purposes for our user to access the system, then we need to make sure that it is isolated from the administrative network, which is our private network. So there are several ways that you can do this through segmentation, or you can also set up a VLAN port for it. But we need to monitor and control that port regardless. Okay. On the next part, before I flip back, this is Radius. This is used for remote access before RAS really came. And it is dial-in. So as you can see, that was from the analog era. Okay. This is still very common. There are still companies still have Radius. So it is a way that their users could be able to access the network. So the common use of it is to access network devices. So I'm home, I can remote into my desktop in my office. I can also implement Radius for wireless and other things, right? For example, you have hand scan type of devices that shipping companies use when they arrive to deliver your package. There are many things that businesses use, so they're still incorporate some of the servers and the type of protocol for that. So this one operates on TCP and UDP, but if password is not strong, right, and it uses weak hash, so the hash algorithm, this one has been compromised. So you want to have something that's more secure. So if you have a Radius in your network, you just gotta know that you gotta beef up your password game. So the policy needs to be implemented and the user has to practice strong password. And then you need to protect the traffic, right? So it is better to implement IPsec because it does the tunnel and the headers is gonna be different. Question? So for 5, we can say that TACACS, it lacks integrity for checking sent data, allowing the attackers to access traffic and make changes or do replay attack. It has encryption flaws. And with that, it would allow the attacker to compromise the keys. So weaker encryption and key exchange process is not secure. For the Radius server, we would say that password storage is not secure. That's one of the flaws. and using shared secret and MD patch. So while some of these technology is, has a lot of security issue, they're still being used. So you have to know what they are, right? If they're used, how to better protect them. Because companies will not get rid of them because they still work. So we want to make sure that we implement security measure and to reduce the risk, right? You're buying more time for your system. So as I mentioned before, right, Kerberos is a Microsoft technology. This is used for authentication purposes. So Kerberos is designed to operate on an untrusted network. But with that, we have to implement a way that we would protect the traffic. So it uses encryption to protect the traffic, especially when password is submitted, security token is being provided by the servers. Once the server receives the authentication object. And it uses, so when we integrate Kerberos, just know that you have to have a key distribution center, your KDC. This is used to distribute keys because remember the other two, the problem with one of them is the key exchange, right? How the key is stored and how the keys are sent. So to really improve the technology, Microsoft went back and integrated the key distribution center. And it relies on certificate-based or a file that really relate to, the process in how, what is needed for in the encryption, right? And the level of trust. So what you see is the KDC that's gonna allow you to have or manage the keys that's being used. Okay. So as you can see, when we transition from an unsecured type of environment into a more of a secured based protocol or technology, you would see that encryption is normally the preference for the secured technology. But you have to ask yourself, how good is that encryption, right? How good is the key management process or exchange? What's requirement for that? And then the performance behind it. Is it responsive, right? Because you don't want something that's very slow. So many organizations would then implement single sign-on, and we have that here, right? You can sign into your Outlook, and then it would use, right, that token to be able to allow you to access other applications like Canvas or OneDrive. Okay. So the benefit of that is it's very convenient for the user. They don't have to remember many different passwords or retype the password. It saves a lot of time for many people. And in enterprise, especially for the group of users that are not tech savvy, right, I should say, that might be helpful, right? Having authenticated to their smartphones, and then with that, they're able to log into other applications and using identity management based token type of application, like your password storage, like LastPass, you're able to synchronize that across the system. However, the drawback for that is it's definitely easy for the attacker to obtain the credential because it is saved or transmitted across multiple devices. So, and I think all the current OS has this capability. Your Apple, your Mac OS also allows you to synchronize, right, your credential for all your applications. So if you're on Netflix on your tablet, you can still use that on your Apple TV and other things, right? Or your smartphones or your computer, if you have a MacBook. So it is seamless and it is easier, I think, for people, but then the drawback in that, someone can find that credential. So I think a lot of the times we weight the risk in how we use technology. So for example, if you use voice command, sometimes you weight the risk, right? You know that it's listening to you all the time. It's gathering your data all the time, but you would accept that risk. But other people, they might not use it, right? I don't use anything voice command based anymore. I turned that off on my phone. Sometimes I wish I had turned it on, but but things are still listening, especially your smart TV. So access model, I think that we talk about this a lot, but RBAC, right? And RDAC, a lot of these things are very important because this is what we operate on. Role-based, the user are assigned based on their job functions. So for you here at Moreno Valley College, your role is a student. So you have student access levels, right? My job here, I'm a faculty, so I have faculty access level. I might have access to application that would have grades and attendance, right? Whereas you have access to learning management system like I am, but my level of access on Canvas is a little bit different. I'm able to design courses and add components where you're able to view and access some of the content and maybe submit, right? So example of that is a sale representative cannot access human resource file or maybe even finance file, right? Because if they're able to access HR or finance, they might commit fraud. Attribute based, I shouldn't say just user, but this could also be system. So the user or system is assigned rights based on the environment. Okay. So an environment could be a location that they work in. So if I work in branch 1, I won't be able to access branch 2. But sometimes you have, people that would go across branches because their responsibility could be, they might want to help out or take over someone's position. So in that case, we would make the exception if you're using attribute based. Attribute based, you often see this also with system, like automated system. So if you use things for like farming or production, sometime attribute based would work. So for example, like certain computing system is only on the manufacturing floor, so it's only able to talk to other systems that's on that floor. And it won't be able to have access or communication or exchange of data with other systems that are in other area. So you might see that. And then rule-based system, and this is what you see with routers and things like that, or wireless router at home or firewall. So user or system is assigned right based on the rule that's established by the administrators. So the user would be, or the system would be granted access to application that would use specific ports only, right? Like, for example, I want a certain system to only use port 9,000, and that would be the rule that's set on that system. It cannot communicate with other ports. And you see this with servers a lot too, rule-based. Any question? Now the common ports are tied to a certain service. So if we don't allow certain ports, right, that basically will block that service. But you can also port forward. You can also do other things to be able to adapt the uncommon port for your network environment. And we talked about ports are just like doors to your home or mansion. So it's a way that we can integrate different communication and services for our system. And then you have the RDAC, which is discretionary, right? So the owner, let me see if it's, oh no, I only had 3 there. So the discretionary based type of model, that is basically based on the ownership. So just like how if you own a piece of land, you can decide on whatever you want to do with that land, as long as it's, you're following the rules of where that land is, right? So it is also rule-based, but let's say that there are no rules to apply. You can build a house on that land because you own it, or you can just make it into a piece of farm where you can grow things or raise animals or whatever, right? But we know that there are rules in zoning and stuff like that. But so for discretionary, if I create the file, I have the privilege I can grant other people permissions based on my ownership, right? In Linux, we would see that with chmod, that we would allow it to change permission, or CHO, right? That change ownership. So I can pass that ownership to you where I would give you full control, and you would be able to have the discretionary on who access that file. So you can change ownership, just like how we would sell that land to someone else, and then they can decide whatever they want to do with that. Okay. So when you go back and you really audit accounts for access, normally we would do a manual review, right? The granular processes that I mentioned to you before, it's best as an analyst to be organized. Okay, same thing with auditing. In security and IT, if you organize your life, it's easier. So that means that we manage the inventory, a list of the systems, its location, name, section of the network, and all of that, right? We also have lists that would relate to that list, which is the account and things like that. So you would do a manual review. And some of this can be automated, where we would have a software or the system that would verify and check. So when you audit the account, really we're trying to look at the discrepancy, right? So for example, I might have a user that is part of different groups, but what that does is it creates, right, escalation of privileges, because that user account should not, based on role-based, their role, they should not be able to have certain type of privileges. So when you go back and you do audit, you would see that they do have higher privilege, and they have also higher permissions in some level because of their group membership, right? So group membership doesn't always work for all things, but it is a streamlined way for us to, add a lot of accounts in there and be able to control a container of all of those accounts. But sometimes you might have situation where you need to make sure that you customize that account so that way it will fit that particular role. Okay. Or in the case where they're very restricted based on the membership that they're in, but they're asked to do other things, then you make the exception, because least privilege is always the key. So for the attack phases, a lot of the times, in order to really do things in the network or trying to jeopardize the network or the system, is through accounts or systems, right? And what we would see with endpoints is that endpoints are your workstation, your laptop, your tablets, your smart devices, things that are used by the user. So the endpoints exploitation, things like keylogger is fairly easy. You can just get the user to download it. But phishing is our world though, right? We have to see how many people fall for it and to teach them. Oh, yeah, one of my former students, she's not in my class this semester, she took this class already. She's doing that at the school district, right? Her job is to write policies and teach people not to get phished in the school district. And she does fun things like, send out emails that get people to click on the link, right? And then if they do, then, it would show them a message and ask them to take some kind of training. Or she would personally have presentations for them to learn. So keylogger would record all the keystroke. Or sometime that could be a Trojan, right? Keylogger is a Trojan, but we can use the Trojan for other things. From a pen testing standpoint or an analyst standpoint, we would look at local administrative rights. Why so? Because on that local host, on that system, what are they allowed to do? Right? On the network, yes, we can control a lot of things, but on the domain, sometimes it is different than on that local system, right? You might be a user on the domain, but an administrator on the computer. Have you seen that? Sure. Where I can install a bunch of things on the local system, but I cannot access certain things on the network at a higher level. I could not configure server, but I might still be able to install things on the computer. So you got to check that, and then your credential and password storage. I know this is long and you don't have to put verbatim, so let me move this down a little bit and then move the other things up. So that way I can still show a few things at once. Okay, so since anything that we use, potentially those could be attacked, right? You already know that. You just have to assess the risk for the things that we use and then find potential flaws in them or existing flaws and then try to reduce them. So for lightweight directory access protocol, when are they not applied? Okay, and what type of attacks could occur? So if you don't use this form of control for access, then this is when so the attack against unsecure binding could happen on LDAP. Basically, also unencrypted traffic can also be used for attack. Capturing traffic that's or exploiting LDAP as an authentication service, sure. So attack for LDAP happens, okay? Binding is used in a hierarchical manner where you might have domains talking to other domains. And also when you reconfigure, so connection between the servers require binding. And so you always want to make sure you have secure binding. Your traffic should always be encrypted because if you have unencrypted traffic, that could be causing risk. It is a vulnerability. When LDAP is not properly controlled, attackers would harvest information, meaning that they would gather information from your directory and then eventually maybe create themselves as users or add them to certain groups, become a certain member of the group and make changes to your directory. Sometimes also corrupt your directory. Imagine, right, Monday morning when your users or your employees come in and nobody can log in because LDAP is what they log in, right? It is a disaster. LDAP injection can also occur. This is through web applications. So as you know, the user can log into their bank account or to pay bills online, and that's through authentication system. So it uses directory service, so LDAP is used. If it is Windows-based, so if injection is used on the system, then they're able to query. Okay. Looking for passwords, looking for certain level of accounts or system. And then even modifying your directory. Now with that, sometimes you know that it ties to other things like database. So our infrastructure really relies on the authentication piece because that authentication system really brings the user to the proper area of the network, right? Whether it's application or email, right? Your email is tied to lightweight directory service. So it is one of the backbone or the key element in the infrastructure. You can find this information on your notes, right? Again, you don't have to write verbatim. But the whole point in this is I hope that you see, you type it, you write it down, you would remember. To the 3 types of attacks, and you just need 2 or 3, and list more. So malware can be placed on the clients and the server system to capture credential. That could be a Trojan or keylogger, right? They can use phishing technique to capture credential. So authentication, that first A is important, and that's usually the area that they look for. Escalation of privilege with Windows exploit. So escalation of privilege just means that they might come in as a lower level user and eventually get to higher level. Could be group membership or could be making configuration changes. Privilege creep using overlooked accounts and rights. Like I mentioned earlier, a user might be in a certain group that gives them more privilege than needed. And that might be overlooked over time, and so they would try to find those type of accounts. Or take advantage of the Active Directory admin account to compromise, or by compromising login, getting the IT people to provide them with credentials. Hello. So if they can get in as an admin account, then they'll be able to, right, make modifications to your Active Directory. Any question? So how can someone have escalation of privilege? How can they perform that kind of attack? Sometimes, most of the times, it's going to be through software vulnerability. The flaws in your software, the bug in the software, right? And your Active Directory is a role in the server OS. or a service that you can install through the software packages. So ultimately, it does have some vulnerability. So how can I tell if there's vulnerability? We should know this by now. How do I know that whether my software has vulnerability or not? Where do I check? The book? No? Where do I check? Come on, you guys, this is 41A. It's not like it's 27 or 25. Where do I check? CVEs, yeah, the common vulnerability databases also. There are tons of resources for the industry. The vendor, right? You go on their website, they have a section for their CVEs. By regulation, they have to document all the issues. There's security communities that you can check. If it's fairly new, right? Okay, very good. So when we decide on a certain software, we can research those things and know what to expect, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about malware too. I think we touch on like Trojans. So Trojans, we know that it masquerades. It might look very simple, benign, common application, like a PDF, PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, text file, but it could be malicious inside. There's many different type of malware. The harder ones to fix are the rootkits. So to really combat rootkits, a lot of times we have to come back to updates and patching. That's going to close out some of the issues because those are security bugs. And depending on the rootkit, some rootkits, every malware has its own intention. There's a goal for every single type of malware, right? So, and when you're looking at certain virus, so virus needs your intervention, but the virus would have a certain intention. Same thing with the rootkit. So by patching, we just reducing the risk. And as you know that about 50% are known to us, or by definition or behavior that's known to the industry, because it's always evolving. We would have layered security in the design, such as whitelisting. That means that we only allow certain things. We also have heuristic detection techniques that it's going to be application behavior based. So for example, if you're looking at heuristic control, let's say that the malware always use the browser to contact the server that's external and be able to feed data, right? So heuristic-based control would be looking at the application, the browser. Yes, it's supposed to connect to the internet, but what is the destination for that particular session? Okay, so the behavior of that can be monitored and controlled. And then we want to also use security software to detect, right? But detecting is already late, so that means it's already there. So a lot of the rootkits will require a little bit of possibly code modification. Some rootkit take advantage of hardware or firmware. Some rootkit take advantage of software. So if it's firmware related, you have to patch the firmware. I've seen rootkits that take advantage of RAM, and there's nothing you can do about except for the module replacing the module, right? Some rootkit stays in hardware and you cannot get rid of them. So it really depends on how they write it, right? a lot of them are written in low level. So instead of using IO libraries. So the OTP, this is very common now, right? Everybody gets a generated passwords to your device, something you have, and then be able to log in with your regular password. So your code and your password is gonna allow you to have multi-factor. But since it's sent through simple message, you would have the flaw in simple message, in which it could be captured. There are tools to be able to find SMS information. Nothing is safe, right? We operate on paranoia mode always. That's true. The most secure things that you can do is to disconnect, right? It's hard to disconnect in this world today, right? You can't work, you can't get paid, you can't pay your bills, you can't apply for a job, you can't. Yeah, so it's hard to disconnect. But we can reduce the things that we use, right? The applications that you know that's not safe, things like that. We can live without some of those. Like TikTok, right? They're trying to ban. Depending on, your lifestyle, I think, ultimately. So for identity attack, we can do an audit on accounts. We would also look at the logs on how the accounts are used. We would look at when it was created and how or if it was modified, because that's important. Someone could be impersonating someone else, and you would see that through the modification or the usage or the change. And then when if the account is disabled, you can also see that, right? Whether the account was deleted or disabled. Now, question is, well, if it's deleted, how can I know? Well, you can always go back to the prior backup, roll it back to recover and look at your server configuration then. But the log should also show all of that, right? That's the accounting piece. So even the account doesn't exist anymore, it should show when it was deleted. And then the prior log should show whether it was modified. So if the person had left the company for a while now, the account might be removed. We can also look. Or sometimes account is disabled for a while and then they get reactivated again. Maybe they get rehired, or also, maybe not. It was someone else that goes in at that account. So as you can see throughout the last few weeks now, we talked about our role being an analyst. A lot of the time we have to do audit, right? Sometimes you would also have to test perimeter I should say perimeter of the network or the system. That means that you have to do a little bit of pen testing. You also need to have a little bit of forensic knowledge and skill, where you would go back and look at incidents or things that happen. You also need to know how to respond, because we need to really be able to derive a report and tell the company, what are the areas to fix and provide some solution on how to fix them. Any question? So there's more, sorry. I try to move down, but you don't have to put all of it. So let's move this one down just in case you're still on 16. Let me move this back up. There are only 2 more bullets that I didn't mention or you probably didn't see. And you just gotta manage the event. So that ties back to logs, the life cycle of the account. And then making sure that we have SOD, separation of duties. We map out the role on the users or the accounts and making sure that there's no overlapping areas that fraud could be committed. So things like if I have a manager in sales, I don't want this person to also have management capability in my finance system or my account payable systems. Only because, you know, they might have say that, oh, I sold 1,000 something and they might, right? Pay for those things and they might commit fraud that way. So theft. So roles that might be overlapped that could create fraudulent activities, then we want to stay away from. So separation of duties is important. But in the case that you see company that has those things, those roles that allow people to have multiple type of responsibility, you always should have a secondary person to check, right? Whistleblower. You should never have someone to do only that job, right? In an enterprise environment, you will have multiple doing it. That's how you can catch fraud. Because if you only have one person that manages the accounting system, that person could be committing fraud for years and you don't see that, especially if they don't take vacation or time off, because then no one would be able to come in and see. But if you have people alternating, you won't be able to catch it more. Those things, right? The business administrative things that also impact us. So, but because, you know, everybody uses systems. Okay, save your work, put it on Canvas. If you're done, I did catch up with grading for most part. If you submit it after Sunday, I haven't gotten to it yet, but I will. Let me stop recording.